Thank you for viewing the PowerPoint presentation of Democracy in Education, chapters 11 through 14, presented by Leslie Marshall, Colin Opseth, and Cynthia Orlando. Chapter 11 focused on experience and thinking, and Dewey surmised that learning experiences were basically broken into two different types: an active or a trying phase and a passive or discovery phase. And from those ideas, he concluded two main thoughts on education. And the first was that an experience is primarily active rather than passive, and it doesn't necessarily have to be cognitive, in that you don't have to process that experience. It can be something that you learn by doing. The second thing is how valuable the experience is depends on the perception of the action and those consequences. So basically, you can think of it as whether students are empowered and what they're learning from that experience and what they're taking away from it. He also believed that experiences that have meaning involve thought or reflection. Those strong experiences have a trial and error phase. Basically, students have to analyze and think about the consequences of what they're learning, and that also leads into comprehension because of that processing that they're doing. And basically, the reflective experience is the process of analyzing. So, to wrap those ideas together, if you have students that are learning, they really need to be doing much more than just bringing in information. They need to be processing it, reflecting on it, analyzing on it, and then categorizing its importance. Doing that really helps students move into uh, a more proficient phase of thought. And that proficient phase of thought is reflection. And reflection is also an experience, because the purpose of thinking is to reach a conclusion. So basically, when a teacher gives a class information to copy and memorize, they're not applying that information. So therefore, they're not really working at the highest levels of thinking. Dewey thought that reflection was really important because doing that experience allowed students to investigate their own thoughts, to think about what the meanings are of what they're learning, and then to categorize its importance. Chapter 12 was about thinking and thinking in education. And one of the quotes from the book, Dewey says that thinking is the method of intelligent learning. He felt that experiences should be unacademic. And that kind of goes against what we think that experiences in the classroom should be, because we think often that if students aren't learning, then they're not experiencing. And Dewey felt something very different. He felt that trial and error activities were very powerful, and that engaging students in activities that were personally interesting to them really led them to higher levels of inquiry and thought, and not doing that interfered with students' thinking processes and really worked at the lower levels of thought. An example could be teaching to the state test would be something that Dewey would have thought would be low-level thinking, whereas project-based learning or problem-based learning would lead students to higher-order thinking skills. In regards to data, he thought of data as materials of thinking, like facts or events or relations between different things. When students are processing data, the power of thinking really comes from reflecting on those materials or reflecting on that data. And the more that they do that, the more that they gather knowledge, the more that they'll be able to categorize that information and use it easier. You could think of it somewhat like a library. If you understand the Dewey Decimal System and you understand how to find what you're looking for, then you're more able to find the information that you need to use. And he also talked about ideas, or taking that familiar knowledge or data and then applying it to something unfamiliar, like the Dewey Decimal example in the previous slide. Dewey stated, "Only by wrestling with the conditions of the problem at first hand, seeking and finding his own way out, does he think." And what Dewey means by that, he means that if you're working in at higher order thinking skills regularly, that you'll be more likely to be able to relate or adapt those ideas to something else outside of the classroom. That's a very important methodology of gaining and grasping knowledge. And then he also talked about applying ideas, and he said once ideas or possible solutions are gathered, they are tested and used to guide and organize further observations. And he also said that ideas animate and enrich the ordinary course of life. What he means by that is that when you are working with a group or working with peers and you're gathering ideas on a regular basis and categorizing those ideas, what you're able to do is you're able to apply those ideas to other ideas. And those ideas, those categorized ideas that you have in your brain, are not as rote as some of the previous assignments that you may have done. So it basically what he's talking about is applying ideas in different contexts. And this part of the chapter was tough to analyze, but that's what we took away from it. Chapter 13 talked about the nature of the method. And he thought about the method as of implementing material efficiently and a way of of achieving desired results. The example that he used was a pianist. And a quote from the book is, "When the pianist is able to create music on the piano, the method has been mastered." And kind of touching on experience again, he thought that experience as the perception of the connection between something tried and something undergone in consequence is a process. And he doesn't really talk much about the differences between method and process, but he tries to explain that concept through the pianist again. And he said when the pianist looks back at the memory of a performance, he doesn't think about the performance as a collection of parts. He thinks of it as an activity. And so, again, experiences don't necessarily have to be cognitive. They don't have to be something that you think about or you think about as you're doing. It can be an activity that you learn by doing. And from that, you draw a memory or an experience that you're able to categorize as part of your data collection process. He also found that there were some problems with separating method from the subject matter. And one of the problems that he found was that concrete situations of experience are lost. And what that means is that if students are not presented with materials that are tapping into their prior learning, then they can't connect to them. And the result is a focus on the method or the methodology. And this results in low-level thinking without intelligent observation. So basically, you could think of if you're teaching a student how to take a test, what does he take from that? Is he able to apply that knowledge in another context? And if not, then that's a problem. He also thought that in that type of situation that there would be a loss of discipline because teachers are forced to use three different ways to regain control of their classroom. And we've all seen that in classrooms where a teacher will be working and delivering a lesson and the students are not engaged. And so often you'll see teachers utilizing these exact same strategies. They're trying to excite their students, or they're trying to shock them, or they're trying to pleasure them, or try to quote unquote meet their needs, or they're punishing them for not participating, or they're asking them or begging them to partake in the lesson. It happens on a regular basis, and Dewey would say that that problem is because you've lost that process of inquiry, and you're working at low levels of thought, and students don't respond to that. And he thought that students that are not working in higher levels of thought lose sight of the reason why they need to be learning. He felt that students that felt they had to learn it rather than students that wanted to learn it were completely different students. Students that had to learn it were not interested in learning, but students who wanted to learn would take control of their learning, and they would learn on their own even without direct instruction from the teacher. In chapter 13, Dewey writes, "Children reciting in arithmetic or grammar are compelled to go through, under the alleged sanction of method, certain preordained verbal formulae. An inevitable corollary of any theory which separates mind from activity is motivated by a purpose." And what he means by that is if students are doing low-level thought, like worksheets or doing very rote learning, they're not going to be interested in learning. They're not going to want to learn. They're not going to take charge of their own learning. And the only way they're going to do that is if there are consequences for not learning. And that's one of the major problems with education today, is that we focus on the consequences and not on the motivation. So he came up with something called the general method. And the general method talks about how students take their past experience and apply it to what they're learning right now. An example that he used was a physician. A physician learns the basic physiological knowledge of anatomy and chemistry, but sometimes the diagnosis is based on the work of other physicians or other patients. And so a good doctor will not rely only on what he's learned. A good doctor will also learn based upon experience and be able to apply those experiences through collaboration and through reading and researching. And so Dewey thought that knowledge of the past and of current technique, of materials, of the ways in which one's own best results are assured was the highest way of processing data and processing knowledge. And he also came up with something called the individual method. And he felt that the individual method had a couple of different parts to it. The first one was a problem, the second was collection and analysis of data, and then taking suggestions and then applying and testing that information. And from those, he came up with some positive strategies for dealing with subject matter. And there were four main strategies. There was directness, open-mindedness, single-mindedness, and responsibility. We'll talk about those next.